All right, so the questions are coming thick and fast, so let's continue on with those. Now, Eric Tate asked me this. My question is related to the business side of things. Do you currently make money from photography? Do you sell photos or do work for certain clients? I understand that most people's night photos are more for personal projects, but if you would have any tips for creating revenue from nightscapes, that would be interesting. Okay, Eric, well, I did address this a little bit with one of my previous comments, but I do make money from photography, mainly from running my Nightscape images workshops. That's the biggest area where I make money. I do sell prints sometimes. Now, to be honest with you, I don't spend a lot of money trying to sell prints, but any time that I have done that, I've been reasonably successful. I've had quite a number of exhibitions where I've displayed my work to the public, and every single time that I've done that, I've had a very good result financially. So yeah, it does sell quite well. I also do work for specific clients. So as I mentioned before, outside of my Nightscape workshops and things like that, I work for some corporate clients and I do some particularly video production for them. On occasion, I've done some photography for them as well, and even some Nightscape images for people. I've done a few portrait type shoots at night for particular clients who have requested that. So hopefully that answers that side of the question. Okay, any tips for creating revenue from nightscapes? Well, it's not an easy genre of photography to actually make money from. In fact, photography in general has some higher areas of income. For example, wedding photography is, in my area here in particular, that's probably the most common area where people actually make money from photography. I know very few landscape photographers that actually make any money. Portraiture is the other one, family portraits, newborn baby shoots, things like that. But that's not what I want to do. I want to do nightscapes, and so I've dug out a niche for myself, and I think the workshops is what I love to do. I think it all comes down to what your passion is. If you love doing something, then that's what you should concentrate on doing, and if possible, make some money by doing that. Okay, let's move on. Sports Video Pro asking a great question. He says, I know you'd recommend the Nikon 11-20 f2 lens for my APS-C Canon 800D, but is there a cheaper lens that is capable of capturing great nightscape images? Now, this is another common thread. People ask me this question all the time. I do have to do one little change to the question though. He's mentioned the Nikon 11-20 f2. That's not right. The lens in question there is a Nikon 14-20 f2. I have one here. This is a Canon mount lens, which I bought, believe it or not, because I don't shoot Canon cameras, certainly not Canon crop sensor. I bought this for people at my Nightscape images workshops to use, because this is a fantastic lens. At f2 aperture is very fast, but you know, you're looking at about $1,000 for that lens, and that's why the question has been asked. Now, there are some other Nikon lenses which are much cheaper, which is the Nikon 11-16 f2.8 and also the Nikon 11-20 f2.8. They're great lenses as well, but they're not quite as fast as this one at f2, and the f2 aperture is the reason I recommend this lens. If you're talking about budget and quality, sometimes those two words don't meet, okay? They don't connect that well. As far as budget lenses, I'd probably recommend the Samyang 16mm f2. That's a crop sensor lens. And also the Samyang 12mm f2. That's a great lens for Fuji cameras and I think Sony cameras. They're APS-C crop sensor cameras. I know quite a lot of people that have those lenses and they're getting some really good results. I know that the quality control is an issue with some of their lenses, and that's where it comes down to. But having said that, I've seen some people with that 16mm f2. It's been a good quality image. Also the 12mm f2. The Laowa is another brand that makes some really good fast aperture lenses. F2, I think there's 15mm. Irix is another one. But some of those lenses are not cheap anymore. They're starting to get up in price. If you want to use a cheap lens, you're talking kit lenses. So kit lenses, whilst they're okay for normal photography, as I mentioned earlier, they have their limitations when it comes to nightscapes. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful. Peter from Poland, I hope I've said that right. It doesn't spell the way I say Peter. But anyway, he's asking, have you ever tried to make Milky Way tracked shots combined with light painted foregrounds? I would like to see your technique. Okay, now Peter, this is something I have done, but not a lot of, because basically that's getting into what's known as composite photography. And it's not my favourite genre of photography. I don't have anything personally against it, but I prefer to shoot the same tripod position without moving the camera to get my shots. So by definition of how star trackers work, that's almost impossible to do, because the camera's actually moving with the rotation of the stars to get tracked shots. Now, sure, you can do this from the same tripod position, but the camera's moving, so it's a little bit different. But what most people do when they're shooting this style of photography is they will take a star shot, say here, track the stars and get awesome star images. Then they will go somewhere where there's a good landscape, take the landscape and blend those in or composite those together. Now, that is great. And in fact, I've seen some really beautiful images. I've done a little bit of that myself, but it's not my favorite genre. And having said that, the other problem is you have to learn how to blend images. And that is an art form. And it very much comes down to how good you are in Photoshop, to be absolutely honest. Especially here where I live in Australia, there's not clean horizons, there's trees everywhere. And if you've ever tried to blend landscape shots with night sky shots with a lot of trees, you'll know the heartache that that can cause, and you'll know what I'm talking about. So Peter, I have done a bit of that, especially with the light painted foregrounds, but I much prefer to blend. And I'm going to discuss blended images in another question. In fact, here we go, Lawrence. We'll talk about Lawrence's question right now. He's saying, would a star tracker help get better detail in my Milky Way shots when living in a class 4 Bortle light polluted sky? Okay, well, there's a few details in this question. Firstly, would a star tracker help get better detail in the Milky Way? Yes, absolutely. There is no doubt that tracked shots of the Milky Way are the sharpest and the most detailed images you will get of the Milky Way. Why is that? Because you can keep the shutter speed longer, you can keep on that, you can lower your ISO, which in turn increases your dynamic range. So there's no question that tracked shots are more detailed than single shots. Now, then we ask the question, what is better between tracked shots or stacked shots? Now, they're two different things, even though you can stack tracked shots. Now, I don't want to confuse anybody with that. As I mentioned before to Peter's question, when you're using a star tracker, you, by definition, are forced into creating composite images. Whereas if you use stacked images for Milky Way shooting, then you're using what's known as blended images. And that is my preferred method. There's a couple of reasons for that. Because I like to shoot my foregrounds lit differently to the background, and I like to focus stack a lot of my foregrounds into my background, then it's much easier for me to leave my camera in the position where it is for the whole duration of all of those shots without moving the tripod, without moving the camera. And so that's where stacked shots or stacking for noise reduction comes into its own. And it works much better for me in my particular workflow and the way that I like to shoot my nightscapes. Having said that, if you want the greatest detail, tracking is definitely the way to go. But then you've got to learn how to blend to make it look realistic in Photoshop, which is a very difficult art form. And it takes, for me anyway, it takes away a little bit from the creative process in the field and puts that creative emphasis way back into post-production. And if you know me, you'll know that I don't really want to spend all my time in post-production. I much prefer to be spending time out in the field, creating and experiencing the environment where we are. Now, Lawrence has also mentioned a class 4 Bortle. Now, there's a Bortle scale to determine how dark a location is. I'm very fortunate here where I live in Australia. We've got pretty much Bortle class 2 and class 3 skies where I shoot predominantly. So if class 4 is a little bit more light polluted than that. So my recommendation to anyone when I talk to them about nightscapes is to get away from the lights pollution. Get away as far as you can. So Lawrence, I hope that appeases your answer just a little bit. Lee Casey Cameron. Thanks, Lee. I really appreciate your question. She's asking me, I'd be interested in printing recommendations, what paper to use to bring out the details, framing, etc., or anything else that impacts on the final image. Okay, first thing I will say is that I have had a lot of images printed and framed, but I'm not I'm not an expert on printing. I don't print anything myself. I send them all out. For me, I've done a lot of printing on gloss paper, both Ilford and Kodak gloss paper, and I love it. It's got so much detail. It brings out the blacks. There's a lot of blacks and dark shadows in my images because we're shooting at night time. So you need to be able to make sure the blacks print well. So whoever you use to print your images, maybe you can get some tests done or something like that, because the black is what will test the printer. Oftentimes they'll end up a muddy grey colour and they just don't look right. It sort of shows up the noisiness of the image. So I've had results with big prints. Now I'm using a 24 megapixel camera with my Nikon Z6, my D750, before that my D610. They're all 24 megapixels, so they're not massive cameras like the D850 or the A7R3 or the A7R4 Sony cameras, which are much more megapixel. So I've had no trouble printing big with my 24 megapixel. As far as, the other thing is with printing, I've not had great success with canvas printing. I've had a few done and I just don't like the finish on my Nightscapes that I get with a canvas print, probably because it's a bit too mottly. Now I know there's different quality levels that you can get in canvas printing. Once again, I'm not an expert on canvas printing, so there'll be people much more qualified than me to talk about that. The other one that a lot of people get is printing on aluminium or metal, and the finish on those is tremendous, fantastic, but you're paying a premium for those. The other thing she talked about was framing. Now when it comes to framing, I have done a lot of picture framing and matting myself, and I taught myself how to do that because it can become very expensive. And what I've done, in fact the other thing I've done, and this is possibly a clue for you, is to recycle frames, use second-hand frames, because let's face it, most picture frames hang on a wall for their whole life, so they don't get bumped and dinted and knocked around. They're in actually quite good condition, and all you need to do is sometimes just get them off the wall, take whatever's in there, put a new mat in, clean up the glass, and you've got a pretty good picture frame. So I do that quite a bit, Lee, and with pretty good results. So hopefully that answers some of your question. Okay, David K has asked, stacked or tracked Milky Way images? Well, which is better? Well, I've just addressed that, David. For me, stacked is better for my workflow, but for other people, they will use tracked because it suits their workflow. So hopefully I've answered that already. Now, what else have we got here? Nature Love has asked this really relevant question. Do you really think full frame is needed to get good Milky Way pictures? Okay, well, this is a tough one because no matter what I say here, someone's going to criticize me. But I'll put it out there. Okay, for most forms of photography, the gear doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what camera you use, doesn't matter what lenses you have, because it's all about your creative ability. But when it comes to nightscape photography, that's not quite the case. Why? Because we're pushing our camera to its extreme limits. So what we want for our nightscapes is the most light gathering power that we can get from both our camera and our lenses. So whilst I've addressed a couple of the issues with crop sensor cameras, here we go. For me, full frame cameras are definitely better than crop sensors when it comes to capturing the Milky Way. I've used all sorts. I've used crop sensor Nikon, Canon, I've used Micro Four Thirds, Panasonic, Olympus, and I've used Nikon and Canon and Sony full frame cameras. And for the type of work that I do with the extreme high ISOs, the full frame cameras definitely perform better. Now, as I've mentioned, you can certainly use your crop sensor camera. You just need to jump through a few more hoops to get the images to look clean, because it's all about that high ISO performance. And it's just the way sensor technology is. Now I can tell you now that the newer crop sensors that are being produced today, as of this very moment, are far better than even the full frame cameras from 5 or 6 years ago. Okay, but it's hard to compare them if you're looking at the technology that is available right now with all of the different cameras. So for me, full frame is the way to go. Doesn't mean you can't take images with either or any camera. And that leads me to one other thing. It's not a specific question here, but I'm going to address it here with this one. People's perception of what a good image is changes between people. So you will find that when you first start with Nightscape photography, you will take images and you think, that is fantastic, that's the best picture I've ever taken. Doesn't matter what camera you're using, you will look at it and say, fantastic, I've got stars, fantastic. But a bit later on, you'll start taking pictures that are far better than that one, and you'll think, oh, gee, that's not a very good picture. And then as you go a bit further down the track, this is hopefully, you'll begin to get even better again, and you will notice that your images improve because you're putting more time and effort into focusing and techniques and post-processing. Now, you be using the same camera, it doesn't matter what the camera is, and you'll notice an improve in your images. So the same is said for the type of camera and lenses. You can be using the best camera in the world and the best lenses in the world and be shooting pretty bad images because you don't understand the techniques. So that's one of the things that comes into this argument as well, how much we know about how to shoot with the equipment we've got. So hopefully I haven't offended anybody by saying any of those things. All right, let's move on. All right, now here we go. Mike Spivey has asked me a question. I would like to know how you do videos at night, what you use and how it's set up. Okay, Mike, that's a really good question, but it is going to require a complete whole video just in itself, which I'm going to do at some stage in the near future. But let me briefly go through it. I use my Panasonic G9 as the main video camera for my day and night shooting for my videos. But when the light levels get really low, that's when I drag out the Nikon Z6 with one of these very fast aperture primes. This is the 20mm f1.8. Or the Sigma 35 1.4, which is probably my favorite lens for shooting ambient night sky, so I can get the stars to shine out, moonlight and all that sort of thing. And some of the low light shots that you're seeing here are shot with that combination. I do have the Samyang 24mm f1.4, which isn't too bad, but it's not as sharp as the Sigma lens, so I much prefer to do the Sigma. Now, having said that, I use the G9 for a lot of my videos where I use lighting. So when I'm explaining things and when I'm showing you camera settings and all sorts of things, I'm actually lighting the scene. And I use various lights. One is my Z96s, which are fantastic because they're a dimmable light, so I can put them to the light levels that I need to. The other one I use is this Godox LED 308 adjustable LED lamp. That's a beauty as well. Love these because they're really bright. Not that I need a lot of brightness sometimes, but if I want to light some agricultural machinery or trees or whatever, I use the light, a big light like that. Now, just before I move on from that, the couple of lenses I use on my G9 for my night shooting, this is a 12 to 35 f2.8 Lumix lens, and that's a really good lens. The autofocus works fantastic on the G9. They've improved the autofocus over the last couple of firmware updates, so it's really good. If I want to go really low light, then I'll use these. This is a 25mm f1.7 lens, and that's equivalent to a 50mm in full frame. This is the 15mm f1.7, so that's equivalent to 30mm in full frame, but that's a really good lens. Look at how tiny it is. So the thing I like about the Panasonic video cameras is everything's so small. This is a 20mm f1.7, and these render beautiful bokeh images, so they're fantastic lenses. So all of those three that I just showed you work particularly well when the light gets really low. And one of the things I really love about the Panasonic G9 is you can do right down to 2 frames per second. Now you can see some videos I've produced here showing some light painting using the 2 frames per second mode in this. I use it quite a lot, and it's really, really handy. The other video camera I use is what I'm recording this with, which is a DJI Osmo Pocket. Now that's not so good in low light, but it's great for mounting in the car. And there's quite a few shots you'll see through the windscreen that I've shot using the Osmo Pocket. Does a great job of that. So, but I'm going to do a complete video on this, so don't stress about that, Mike. I'll get back to that question shortly. All right, now what is our next question? Okay, Lewis Cruz asked me the question, why do you sometimes decide to use the Nikon D750 instead of the mirrorless Z6? And I noticed that in your last Star Trails video you did. Okay, well, it's a really good pickup, Lewis, and thanks for the question. Now, I still have 2 D750s as well as my Z6. So the Z6 I use as my primary Nightscape camera these days, but the D750s are still excellent cameras. And one thing I've noticed about them in relation to them and the Z6 is the D750s have a better battery life. So if I wanted to shoot something that's going to take a lot of time, for example, time lapse, star trails, things like that, then often I will use the D750. And that's why you would have seen recently I've used the D750 for that star trail video. But the other reason is because I'm usually shooting two things at the same time. So if I'm setting up a time lapse and I'm probably using my D750 for that, and that's going to be going for 2 or 3 hours, then I use the Z6 for my other shots. So I'll go off somewhere else and start shooting again. So the D750 is still a great camera, and I highly recommend that. And that's why you would have seen me use that plenty of times. All right, now this is a really good question. Brian Heno asked the question, "Hi Richard, can you explain how you find your locations for nightscapes?" All right, now I have done a lot of videos on searching locations. You can check here, but in a nutshell, the way I find my locations, firstly, is to get in the car and drive around. Because interestingly enough, what I'm searching for are foreground subject matter. First and foremost, that's what I'm looking for. So rather than even think about what the night sky is doing, I'm looking for foreground interest. So old machines or trees or you know, hills or whatever it looks like good in a foreground. That's my first consideration. And the only way I can do that is to jump in the car and go looking. Sure, I can look on Instagram or look on Facebook or whatever and see what people have shot. But that's not my primary method. That's what I do. I just jump in the car and I go looking. Now, if I'm going on a trip somewhere, like recently I went to Tasmania last year, and I did a fair bit of research before I went because I didn't want to waste time just driving randomly around trying to find locations. So I looked up other YouTube videos, tourist videos, things like that, just to see what locations there might be there. Once I get some ideas of where I might be going to go, then I work out what direction I'm going to be facing. So if you're talking about Milky Way and how to find the Milky Way and various star constellations, then my go-to program is Stellarium. And I particularly like the Stellarium desktop version because what that does, it gives you a very accurate information of what direction to face to find the Milky Way. A lot of people ask me about how do you find the Milky Way? You know, the Milky Way is huge. To be honest, when you're out on a dark location at nighttime and the Milky Way's up there, you will not miss it. It is big. Now, but as far as planning goes, I use Stellarium pretty much. And in the field, when I'm out scouting during the daytime, I like to use Photopill's augmented reality view, because with that, you can just grab your phone, put it up, enable the augmented reality view in the program, and you can actually scroll through and see exactly where the Milky Way or any other star constellation is in relation to that foreground subject matter. So that's what I do, but it all comes down to legwork. If you leave it all to when you want to go out at night time and it's dark, you won't find anything. So that's my suggestion. And Gen X Fashion has asked a very similar question, so I'll just tag that on there, asking me, how do you locate the Milky Way in the sky? And also, what camera settings do you start with? Okay, well, I've just talked about how to locate the Milky Way. Stellarium's my go-to, and Photopills. All right, camera settings. Well, in a nutshell, camera settings, you would open your aperture up very wide. So if your lens is an f3.5, take it at f3.5. If it's 2.8, go to f2.8. You need a fairly wide angle, generally, to shoot the Milky Way in the nightscapes. So let's just say you have somewhere between 14mm and 24mm lens. That's what I would suggest. And as far as shutter speed goes, you need to have a shutter speed that is long enough to capture enough light for your night stars to show through, but not too long that the stars move and create star trails. Now, there's a fine balance there. That is totally dependent on the focal length of your lens. So a shorter lens, for example, like a 24mm, 35, 50mm, you need a much shorter shutter speed. But if you have a wide angle lens like a 12mm or a 14 or a 16mm, you can afford to have your shutter speed a bit longer. Now, that's a very, very cut down version. We need to probably go into more detail than that. All of my videos pretty much address that issue. And I think I'll probably put together this year some more basic videos to help people with that sort of basic stuff. So hopefully that's helpful to you. What a fantastic place to be, to shoot anything, to be honest. Great view from up here, which basically leads me to the last couple of questions on our Q&A today. So, Jen Q asks a question: why do you have such passion for shooting nightscape images? Don't you get tired of the late and cold nights? Well, Jen, I have huge passion for shooting nightscape images. And where did that come from? Well, I'm not sure exactly, but it began when I was just this big. I mean, I've been shooting and loving the night sky for years. The real passion that you're seeing now really only manifested itself in probably the last 6 years, when I really got serious about getting out and shooting nightscape images. And as for your question about how do I motivate myself to get out of bed at night? Well, that's a great question, and it is the single most common factor that stops people from shooting nightscape images. They sleep in, they can't be bothered, it's too cold, it's too far to travel in the middle of the night, they're scared of the wildlife, kangaroos or whatever. Well, all of those things are factors, believe me. But I'll tell you what, this is the most beautiful thing, to be sitting in a chair like this on a gorgeous night with the Milky Way stretching across the sky. You cannot beat that. And it is a passion that has been lit inside me many years ago, and I've loved the night sky, as I said, since I was a young child. But even now, as I'm getting a bit older, I absolutely am enthralled by the night sky every time I come out. So I would say my passion is probably greater now than it's ever been. And so I spend my time out under the stars, not because I have to, or not because I really need to do anything, because I want to. I love it. Now, yeah, getting out of bed sometimes is difficult, and staying up and being out all night sometimes is difficult. On the other hand, sometimes it's an awesome adventure, and I grasp it with both hands, and I still absolutely love it. Okay, now our final question today comes from Anne Wiley, and it's very similar to that last question, so I'll try and address it a little bit differently. What motivates you to produce these wonderful YouTube videos on nightscape photography? Okay, that's a really good question, because whilst it's very much related to the answer I just gave you for the last question, producing the videos opens up a whole new world of pain as far as commitment level and technical expertise and equipment that I've got to actually carry with me. What motivates me? I guess it's my love, firstly my love of the night sky, but secondly it's my love of producing video. Video production is something that I've been doing for many, many years, but I've always been on the other side of the camera. So there's always been other people who have been the talent, if you like, and people who have been the subject, and it's been about them. Now suddenly it's about me and my journey and what I'm seeing and experiencing out here. And so that took me a little bit of getting used to be absolutely honest with you. But you know, I do it because I love sharing my passion. Like I said before, I am so passionate about my nightscape photography and how to achieve this, that I felt like the best way to share that is to create this YouTube channel. So that's what I've done. But the other thing, and this is something that I've realized since I've been shooting for this channel, is that getting out now, like in the daytime, like I am right now, has opened up a whole new world for me. You see, I just love being out in the landscape. So whilst I don't consider myself to be a landscape photographer as such, I love the landscape, and I'm so connected to places like this, away from the city lights, away from civilization. And by producing these YouTube videos, it gets me out to places like this. And so I've got a double whammy. Firstly, I'm out shooting nightscapes in the environment that I absolutely love with a passion. And secondly, now I'm out during the daytime, like I am now, shooting YouTube videos at another place that maybe I wouldn't be visiting otherwise. And so I love that with a passion as well. So I guess my motivation is passion. You know, I don't have kids at home anymore. I've got a little bit more free time because I'm a full-time content producer and video and photographer. Then my time is myself. I can do what I want, when I want, within some limitations. So here I am producing YouTube videos and answering questions from you guys, and I've absolutely loved the time that I've had with you here today. I hope it's been beneficial to you, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. I've got quite a few coming up in the future. If you'd like to subscribe to the channel, absolutely love to have you on board. I really enjoy reading the comments, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of comments about this video. So however that pans out, well, I'm all cool with that. So in the meantime, I hope you guys have an absolutely awesome day, and I'll look forward to seeing you real soon.